Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Brookings India. My name is Dhruva Jayashankar. I'm Fellow for Foreign Policy here. And on behalf of Brookings India, I'd like to welcome you to this afternoon's talk. We have a very special guest here to address us this afternoon, a colleague from the Brookings Institution in Washington, Shadi Hamid, who's a senior fellow there. Shadi is also a contributing editor at The Atlantic. He is also an outspoken and doesn't shy away from being provocative as a speaker, which is why we're very keen on having him here. And don't just take it from me, take it from his 113,000 Twitter followers. He is the author, most recently, of Islamic Exceptionalism, How the Struggle Over Islam is Reshaping the World, a book that was released in 2016 and which has an Indian edition, which is available here, and which will be the subject of his talk today. The book was shortlisted for the 2017 Lionel Gelber Prize. He's also the co-editor with Will McCants, now a former Brookings Institution fellow, of Rethinking Political Islam, and co-author of Militants, Criminals, and Warlords, The Challenge of Local Governance in the Age of Disorder. His first book, Temptations of Power, Islamists and Illiberal Democracy in a New Middle East, was named one of Foreign Affairs' best books of 2014. Shadi previously served as Director of Research at Brookings Doha Center until 2014, and has also worked, amongst other places, as a fellow at the American Center for Oriental Research in Jordan, at the US State Department and the US Senate, and he studied at Georgetown University and has a PhD from Oxford. So without further ado, let me turn over the podium to Shadi Hamid for his address on Islamic exceptionalism in West Asia and the West. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dhruva. Thanks to Brookings India for having me. It's great to be here. It's actually my first time in India. And thanks to all of you for coming. So I'll get right into it. The last 10 years or so in the Middle East, obviously a lot has happened. And I think for me, it's been very interesting as an academic and as a scholar, but also it's taken a personal toll, if you will. There's been a personal aspect to being based in the Middle East and seeing the level of optimism there first was, and then to see the decline and really the end of the Arab Spring. So kind of being a witness to that has affected me. And I think generally speaking, for those of you who have lived in the Middle East, you might relate to this. The Middle East has a way of changing you. And, you know, it's funny, some of my friends tell me that I've become more pessimistic, and I think I have as a result of my time in the Middle East. And I'll try to share some of those insights and what I took from those experiences. But not only have I become more pessimistic, I've come to appreciate more and more the role of religion. So if you talked to me maybe 10 years ago, I would have had a little bit of a different view than the one that I have now. But over those years, and I lived about 6 of the last 12 years, give or take, in the Middle East, that's something that really stuck with me. And that will be, to some extent, the subject of what I talked to you about here today, is trying to appreciate the role of religion, in this case Islam, in public life, and trying to understand how much it matters. And this is the question that I think so many of us have been wondering about in light of recent events, is how much of this is about religion? How much does Islam matter? And I'll just give you one example of, you know, a kind of experience that really stuck out for me and that has stayed with me until now, is I was talking to a Muslim Brotherhood mid-level official. This was before the Arab Spring in 2010, and we were having a conversation about why people joined the Muslim Brotherhood. And we went through a number of different factors. Rural-urban migration, a lack of economic development, being pissed off at the US, all of these things matter. All of these things are factors. But he told me, Shadi, sometimes it's a lot more simple than that. Sometimes people join the Muslim Brotherhood because they want to get into heaven. And I thought that was a very nice way of putting it, and I still think about that. And it does make, so I think that if we come from a sort of Western secular background, we hear that and we think that's irrational or unreasonable. But actually, if your starting premise is that there is a heaven, that's the most rational thing you could possibly do, is to try to become a better Muslim. And if you become a better Muslim, then you'll have a better chance on the Day of Judgment. And the idea here is that an organization like the Muslim Brotherhood structures your life in a way to make you more practicing, more observant, so on and so forth. So if you believe in heaven, what could be more rational than planning ahead for eternity? And that also forces us to question our view of what's rational and what's not. And, being in graduate school in political science, very rarely was paradise brought up. That's not something we talked about in graduate seminars. And it would be weird if we did, right? But thinking about the afterlife has become a more important part of my work, interestingly enough. I'll just get some water. So let me move into this question of is there something fundamentally different about Islam? So, as you can tell by the title of the book, the argument is in the title, that Islam is in fact exceptional. That is the argument that I'm making. Now, I'm going to have to be careful because aspects of this argument have been misunderstood since the book came out. So when I talk about exceptionalism, I'm not just talking about it in a general sense, because all religions are unique in their own ways, right? My argument here is that Islam is exceptional in a specific way, in how it relates to law, politics, and governance. So that's what I'll be focusing on. And when I talk about exceptionalism, I'm using it in a kind of value-neutral sense. Exceptionalism can be either good or bad, depending on the circumstances. So I want to challenge you, and I want to challenge everyone really, to sort of resist the temptation to think that just because Islam might be fundamentally different in certain ways, that makes it bad, or that makes it a problem to be solved. So I'm making an argument about exceptionalism, but try to withhold judgment, if you will, on whether or not that's necessarily a bad thing. It depends on the context. It depends in what ways Islam manifests itself in public life. Now, so what does this mean to be exceptional? So Islam has, in both theory and practice, has played an outsized role in public life and politics. In both theory and practice, Islam has proven to be resistant to secularization. And then the question then is, why is this the case? And I won't go into all the details about the argument. I'm just kind of giving the highlights here. So just take for granted that the argument is much more complicated and there's a lot of caveats, but I'll just focus on the main arguments here. If you want the details, there's one way to address that, which is to buy the book, of course. Why would Islam be exceptional in this regard? Well, I think to answer that question, we have to go back to the founding of Islam. The founding moment of a religion matters. And I think there's a tendency when we talk about Islam and politics, and as political scientists, we focus very much on what's happened recently. But I think that theology and history matter. So if we go back to the founding moment, there are important distinctions between, say, Islam and Christianity, and that's the comparison that I'll focus on because it's most relevant living in the US. But basically, if we look at Prophet Muhammad, Prophet Muhammad wasn't just a prophet, he wasn't just a theologian, he wasn't just a man of religion, he was also a politician. And not just a politician, but a head of state. And not just a head of state, but a state builder. So these are aspects of Prophet Muhammad's, of his sort of prophethood that are intertwined with the religious components. And if we compare that to, say, Christianity, there are some stark differences. Jesus was not in a position to govern. Jesus was a dissident against a reigning state. So naturally, the New Testament isn't going to have a lot to say about governance, because that's not what the New Testament was addressing. That was not the context that Jesus was in. But naturally, if we're talking about the Quran, if Prophet Muhammad is in a position to govern, then the Quran necessarily has to address questions of law and governance. Now, it doesn't matter whether or not you believe, so Muslims more or less by definition believe the Quran is divine, and they would argue that that God is essentially the one who's making these arguments, and that God has to address the specificities of Prophet Muhammad's context. But even if you're not a believer, if you're just looking at it from a kind of outside anthropological viewpoint, the Quran still is going to have to address a certain socio-political context. And it's going to have to address the issues and challenges that Prophet Muhammad and the early Muslims were dealing with on a daily basis. And one of those was what happens if you capture territory. If you capture territory, you have to figure out what to do with it. You have to figure out how to govern it. Now, the second factor that contributes to exceptionalism that I'll mention briefly, and it's a very complex theological issue, but I'll do the short version, which has to do with scripture. How do Muslims view the Quran? So if you, Muslims as a creedal requirement believe that not only is the Quran the word of God, they go one step further. They believe it's God's actual speech. And I really want to emphasize this. This means that, and this is, again, a matter of creed, so there is no debate among Muslims or scholars about this, that every letter and word of the Quran is directly from God. There is no human role in terms of the actual content. Now, if you look at Christianity by comparison, of course there are evangelicals who will say that the Bible is the word of God, but they do not say that the Bible is God's actual speech. And this should almost be self-evident, because we know that there were different personalities who wrote parts of the Bible. Now, evangelicals would say that God protects the text from falsehood, but there is no doubt that there is a human role. No one would argue otherwise in the Christian context. So this is an important difference, and I think this is sometimes where Muslims make comparisons between the Quran and the Bible, and this isn't actually the right comparison to make, because Muslims view the Quran differently than Christians view their own scripture, the Bible. So I would actually argue that the equivalent of the Quran in the Christian context isn't a book, but a person. It's Jesus, the Word made flesh. And I think that that's something that Muslims don't always, in terms of making these comparisons. Anyway, okay. So, but what does this mean? So I gave you two factors here which contribute to this kind of unique relationship to law and governance. I want to be clear here. Muslims are not bound to their founding moment. No one is bound to their founding moment. But that doesn't mean that you can fully escape your founding moment either, and this goes for all religions. So can Christians who are not just nominal Christians, but actual Christians in the full sense of the word, can they escape the founding moment of Christianity? No. In the case of Islam, can you escape the founding moment of Islam? No. But why would you want to? Muslims generally wouldn't want to disassociate themselves from the founding moment. And in fact, the prophetic model is still very important to any Muslim you meet. The prophet matters, and he's someone to emulate. So this has implications 14 centuries later, if we sort of fast forward to the modern era, that there are secularists, Muslims who are secularists in the sense that they argue for the separation of religion from politics. This is certainly possible, and there have been very brave reformers who have made these arguments that secularism is the way forward for Muslims and it's preferable to the alternatives. Now, these arguments, though, have failed to gain traction, and I would argue they will continue to fail to gain traction Because basically secularists have an uphill battle in a Muslim, especially a Muslim majority context. They have to basically argue against the prophetic model. They have to look at Prophet Muhammad being a politician and being the head of a proto-state in Medina, and they have to essentially say that that was a matter of history that stays as history and is no longer relevant or applicable in any way. That's essentially the argument they have to make. Now, that's a difficult argument to make to ordinary Muslims who just want to live a straightforward life and don't want to go into very complex hermeneutical arguments about why certain aspects of Islamic history, of even the Prophet's model, are no longer relevant in the modern context. So it's not a very easy argument to make, and that's one reason I would posit to you that it hasn't really been successful. Now, if you accept my premise that about Islam's outsized role in politics in both theory and practice, the question then begins: how exactly does this matter? So this is sort of a theoretical argument. It's, you know, perhaps you could argue it's somewhat speculative. Okay, so I want to move now to looking at practical examples of how this manifests itself in everyday politics. So, you know, when we look at the last, you know, again, the last 10 years or so in the Middle East, and it's obviously a mess, and there are, what, 3 or 4 different civil wars simultaneously. I mean, when we look at the rise of ISIS, or if we look at the demise of the Arab Spring, the two kind of, let's say, major events of the Arab Spring period, I think there's a tendency to kind of look at those things as products of very recent developments. So people will cite, obviously, 2011, the start of the Arab Spring. They'll go back a little bit and cite 2003, the Iraq War. And it tends to be a kind of narrow context. I think to understand these developments, we have to go back not just to the founding moment, but we have to also look earlier in the 20th century. And there's one key date that I want to emphasize, 1924. And this is obviously a very smart crowd because I just saw people nodding. 1924, yeah. But 1924 is important because it marks the formal abolition of the last caliphate, the Ottoman Caliphate. And from the time Prophet Muhammad established the proto-state in Medina, and after his death, when there was a caliphate from his death onwards, that there has always been either one caliphate or several caliphates competing with each other from that period until 1924. So 1924 marks the first time when, as a Muslim, you look around and you can no longer say that there is something that would be the legitimate representative, if you will, of the ummah, of the Muslim nation. So that presents a set of problems that I would argue stay with us to this very day, that ever since 1924, there has been an ongoing struggle to establish a legitimate political order in the Middle East. And at the center of that struggle are a set of unresolved questions. They were unresolved then, and they remain unresolved today. And these are questions around Islam's relationship to the state's relationship to Islam, and just the role of religion in everyday public life. Now, part of the problem here is that pre-modern, let me put it this way. Islam was not designed for the modern nation state. And of course it wasn't. It wasn't revealed to people who were living in modern nation states. It was revealed in a pre-modern era, so naturally it's speaking to a pre-modern context where states were much more weak. States were not powerful, bloated, all-encompassing, surveilling everything as they are now. So this changes matters fundamentally, and I would argue, moreover, that Islamic law, develops a very rich body and diverse body of Islamic law, develops in a pre-modern context where, again, the relationship to states is quite different. Now, how do you sort of square that circle if Islam and Islamic law specifically Islamic law isn't naturally suited for a modern state, because what does a modern state do? A modern state codifies law. The thing about Sharia is that you can't find it anywhere. There is not a piece of paper or a piece of many papers where you can say, here are statutes and provisions, and this is what Sharia is. And it's really only in the modern context that we start to see law as something written down and very discernible. It's something that you can grasp, it's tangible. Where Sharia evolved as a very rich, diverse tradition that you could never find in one book, you would find it in thousands of books in different contexts. So this is the challenge of trying to basically adapt pre-modern law to the modern period. And this is where I move on to the question of what we call Islamism. Because Islamists come as a response to this fundamental challenge in the 20th century. So with the challenge of secularization and Western ideologies, some would say, being imported into the Middle East, for the first time, there is this group of people who say that Islam has to be asserted. And this is basically what Islamists are. Islamists are those who believe that Islam and Islamic law should play a central role in public life, and they organize politically around that goal. And there's a reason why they didn't exist before the 20th century. Islamism only makes sense in opposition to its opposite, which is secularism. So when you have these modernizing states that are secularizing society and trying to take control over society in the sense of the state has more domain over private life, that Islamists feel a need to sort of resist that secularizing impulse. Where if you look at the pre-modern era, the word Islamism didn't exist, and it couldn't have existed, because Islam was the moral, legal, and religious architecture. It was unquestioned. It imbued everything. No one was a secularist 5 centuries ago. So if something went without saying, it didn't need to be said. Where today, in the modern era, it doesn't go without saying, so you have a group of people who need to say it, in this case, Islamists. So now for the first time, Islam has become a distinct political project. It's something to be applied in a very self-conscious way. And this leads to basically what is the fundamental divide. Obviously, there are many divides: religious, identity, ethnic, economic. But I would say that the fundamental cleavage in most Middle Eastern societies is around these sets of questions. Basically between Islamists on one hand and non-Islamists on the other. And of course, this is an oversimplification. There are a lot of shades in between. But if we look at the collapse of, say, the Arab Spring in Egypt, and I'll get into this a little bit more, we see that as being the fundamental divide. Just like, let's say, there was a time in the US or in Europe where the fundamental divide was between left and right, where in the Middle East, it's between Islamists and non-Islamists, if you want to sort of see that as the spectrum. Now, I'll just mention an important instance here that I think captures this divide in a very stark fashion. So the first chapter of my book, to kind of lay out the scene, I titled it in a sort of dark, pessimistic way. The title of that chapter is "To Take Joy in a Massacre." And I wanted to start with the massacre because I think, well, it had an effect on me. So basically, after the military coup against the democratically elected government of the Muslim Brotherhood and Mohammed Morsi in Egypt, there was the military coup of July 3rd, 2013. And then there was what Human Rights Watch calls the worst mass killing in modern Egyptian history. So about 1,000 people were killed in one day, pretty much in broad daylight, actually. This happened on August 14th, 2013. So after the coup, the supporters of the Brotherhood and Mohammed Morsi camped out in 2 sites in Cairo and refused to accept the legitimacy of the new leadership. Now, I was in Egypt in the lead up to the massacre, and so I left 2 days before it happened. So I left August 12th, 2013, but I was able to see the kind of mass hysteria and sort of what I would describe as the desire to kill your fellow countrymen. I was actually able to see that in the lead up to that day. And how do we sort of explain that people who claim to believe in a democracy at the start of the Arab Spring turned against it very quickly just in the span of 2.5 years? The issue here was that what we might call the anti-Islamists, or people who would be called the secular elite, although they're not necessarily secular, but that they felt that their country was being fundamentally changed, that these debates over the role of religion were existential. They were over the meaning and purpose of the nation state. They were over what it fundamentally meant to be Egyptian or Tunisian or Jordanian. And these are a different set of debates that are harder to resolve because they're intangible. You can't put a number on them. And it's hard to also reason with people because it does affect their everyday life, how you relate to your own state, and how you view your own government. Can you see yourself in your own government? And when Islamists were doing well in elections and governing, there were many more secularly oriented Egyptians who said, we no longer recognize our own country. So that's part of the existential aspect here. So people were not debating economic issues. They were not debating universal health care or tax policy. They were debating questions that were very fundamental, and in a sense, the basics of political theory. Now, I would have said, if we were talking a few years ago, I would have basically said that this is a fundamental difference between, say, the Middle East and Western democracies. But it's interesting now, and I've been writing a little bit more about this, about how Western democracies are now catching up with the Middle East in a way, that the debates that we have in my own country, the US, they're not about, I mean, religion is part of it, but they are about what it means to be American. And people don't, tax policy matters, but that's not the fundamental divide in America. The fundamental divide is over things that seem to be much deeper. And you could argue the same for, say, France or Denmark and so on. So that part of it is interesting, and we might, we can get back to that a little bit in the Q&A. Now, as I just close up here, I want to consider a couple different ways to resolve these fundamental divides, to maybe be a little bit more practical and think about how this plays out. So one option is to say that, hey, Islam plays this outsized role in politics, and this is a problem. And it's a problem to be addressed by governments, in the sense that governments should work to either secularize in a kind of forced authoritarian manner. That was attempted in certain cases, such as in Turkey and Tunisia for decades in the 20th century. Or you don't have to have forced secularization per se, but you can have a policy to exclude Islamist parties, to say that any party that defines itself as Islamist should not have a right to participate. So this is an option that is basically authoritarian. And for a number of reasons, I don't think that is the best approach, not just politically and pragmatically, because excluding parties tends to backfire over time, because if parties represent a significant portion of the population, if you push them out of the political process, then they have an incentive to play spoiler and to undermine the entire process. So you want to find a way to bring them in. But also from a moral perspective, and maybe this is just because I'm American, but I'm not a big fan of repression, as from a moral perspective. But anyway, so that's option number one. And I think tied to that is this kind of idea that Islam should have a reformation. And this is something we hear a lot, and it's really, in some sense, has become one of the very powerful narratives that never quite goes away. But basically the idea here is that Islam has to follow the same trajectory that Christianity did. So it goes through a reformation followed by an enlightenment, secularization, leading to the end of history of liberal democracy. So you tend to see history as this long progressive march, and history has its own logic that no one can really avoid. And I think that if you're coming from a Western perspective, this seems obvious because, you're like, hey, why can't Islam follow the same course as Christianity? But if Islam is fundamentally different in the ways that I mentioned earlier, then Islam not only won't follow the same course as Christianity, but that it can't follow the same course as Christianity. And it's also a little bit weird as an argument when you have, when people will say, basically, oh, you Muslims, it's really hard for you now, but don't worry, we went through it too. It'll just be a matter of time before you guys get your act together and go through the same thing that we Christians and Westerners went through. It's also a bit patronizing to sort of approach people with that kind of perspective. So if hopes for a reformation are misplaced, then what do we have left in terms of our options? Granted, this is not a perfect solution, but I do think it is the better and actually best solution out of the ones that are available, at least. And that is to find a way to accommodate Islam's role in public life. That if Islam plays this role, and again, I'm arguing that it's neither bad nor good. It can be good it can be bad in some contexts, and we see that with violent militant groups, but it can be good in other aspects where religion gives people, offers social cohesion, stronger communities. It inspires people to mobilize politically, to challenge authoritarian regimes. It depends. It's both good and bad. So, but regardless of that, then the goal should be to say, hey, this is where we are. There are large majorities in many of the countries that I've mentioned in the Middle East where people say they want Islam, and specifically Sharia, to play a central role. So if that's the case and that's the popular desire, and granted, many people who say this aren't necessarily Islamists, and not to get into all the definitions and debates, but even people who aren't Islamists generally say, at least to pollsters, that they want aspects of Islamic law to be reflected in government. So the question then is, how do we come to terms with Islam's role in public life? And part of that has to do with basically, and this is what ideally any democracy should do, democracy should accommodate for diverse perspectives, including those perspectives that are more conservative or believe in a more strict interpretation of Islamic law, as long as they play by the rules, as long as they organize through the democratic process and respect the existing laws and constitution. And that's the same for any country, really, when we're talking about white nationalists in America or the National Front in France. I think the argument applies in a lot of different contexts that we say we might not like these movements, but as long as they operate within the law, then we have to find a place for them in public life. And we also have to learn to live with difference on these fundamental questions. Now, so I'll just, and I think that this argument, and I'll kind of close with this thought, I think this idea, so people on the right, at least in the American context, have criticized me for arguing that Islamist parties have to have a role, and they have the right to participate. But I've also been criticized from the left that that I'm kind of going against this idea, which is sort of a tenet of the liberal faith, that we as human beings, we're all fundamentally the same. When it all comes down to it, we have our specificities, but we all basically want to live peaceful lives, raise our kids, have good schools, improve the economy, and that's a kind of universal human thing. And it's actually, it actually doesn't matter a whole lot whether someone's one religion or another. And some of you might remember this. I don't know how popular the actor Ben Affleck is with an Indian audience, but probably you guys have heard of him. But you might recall that there was an October 2014 debate between him, Bill Maher on the Bill Maher show, and the kind of hardcore atheist Sam Harris. And Ben Affleck, he was doing something very nice, and it was it meant a lot to, I think, a lot of American Muslims to see someone of his prominence defending Islam and Muslims. And we're like, wow, we've never seen this before. Ben Affleck, this is great. But part of his argument, upon further reflection, made me a little bit uneasy. Basically, his argument, and this is almost a direct quote, he basically said something along the lines of, Muslims like to eat sandwiches too. And I can vouch for that. Muslims do like to eat sandwiches too. But it felt like a very simplistic and, again, patronizing way of talking about religious difference, that he felt a need to say that Muslims are just like everyone else, instead of acknowledging that difference is good sometimes. Democracy is about accommodating people with fundamentally different beliefs and doing so peacefully. We don't have to get rid of all our differences in order to have a successful functioning democracy. So I remember watching that and thinking to myself, and that was actually a very, while I was writing the book, I remember that really sticking out to me and thinking to myself, you know, hey, we aren't all the same, and we don't have to be, and in some ways we shouldn't be. So I'll end there and look forward to your questions. Thank you.